Welcome back to Revenge Plus, where revenge isn't just sweet, it's unforgettable. Let's dive into today's unforgettable story. I still remember the day it all started. It was a warm, quiet evening, much like any other. We had just finished dinner, sitting on the couch, sipping on wine and casually chatting. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but that night, I felt something strange in the air. It wasn't until he looked at me, his eyes shifting uncomfortably, that I knew something was off. "You know," he started, almost too casually, "I never really thought we'd make it this far." His words were like a slap in the face. For a moment I was stunned, unsure how to react. I thought we were in a good place, happy even. But what he said next shattered everything. "I've been using you, and you've never even noticed." I froze, the room felt like it was closing in on me. The words echoed in my head over and over like a haunting refrain. I wanted to yell, to scream, to demand answers, but instead I sat there in silence. The truth hit me hard. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed, it was all a lie. I had been his puppet for 3 years, and he had been pulling the strings the whole time. You might think it's crazy, right? How could I not have known? How could I be so blind to the manipulation, to the deceit? But that's what makes this story so difficult to tell, because when you're in it, when you're wrapped up in the emotions and the moments, you can't see it. It's easy to ignore the signs, to excuse the red flags. I certainly did. But now, looking back, I can see it all. The subtle manipulations, the way he would use my trust, my love, to get what he wanted. How he would make me feel guilty for the smallest things, always twisting the narrative until I questioned my own reality. I thought he loved me, I thought he cared. But in truth, I was nothing more than a tool to him, a means to an end. So, what do you do when you realize that everything you've ever known is a lie? When the person you trusted most in the world has been using you for their own gain, how do you process the betrayal? It's a question I've asked myself over and over. And trust me, the journey I'm about to take you on isn't easy. It's filled with pain, betrayal, and a deep sense of loss. But it's also a journey of self-discovery, of strength, and ultimately of victory. I could have walked away then. I could have chosen to leave, to cut my losses and move on, but I didn't. Instead, I chose something far more dangerous, far more satisfying. I chose revenge. It wasn't about getting back at him for the sake of it. It wasn't about hurting him in the way he hurt me. It was about reclaiming my life, my power, and my identity. It was about turning the tables, about showing him that he couldn't break me, that I was stronger than he ever thought possible. And that's exactly what I did. I took everything he had used against me and turned it into something powerful. Something no one could take from me. I turned my pain into fuel, and I turned that fuel into a book that would eventually become a bestseller. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when I questioned everything. There were moments when I wanted to give up, to let the bitterness consume me, but I kept pushing forward. I kept writing, kept telling my story, kept fighting for my voice to be heard. Now, as you sit there hearing this story for the first time, you might be wondering, how could someone do something like that? How could someone use another person so cruelly, so mercilessly? And more importantly, why didn't I see it sooner? These are questions I've asked myself too, but the answers didn't come right away. It took time, reflection, and a whole lot of heartache. But I learned something along the way. Something I want you to understand too. You see, when you're in a toxic relationship, when you're being manipulated, it's easy to lose sight of who you are. It's easy to forget your worth, to let someone else dictate your happiness. But the moment you realize your own value, the moment you wake up to the truth of what's been happening, everything changes. I woke up. And when I did, I realized something powerful. I realized that I could take control of my life again. I could turn this whole situation into something meaningful. And that's exactly what I did. But this story doesn't end with me just writing a book. Oh no, this is only the beginning. What comes next? You'll have to keep watching to find out. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. The truth is, I had never seen it coming. How could I? He was charming, attentive, loving even. At least that's what I thought. On the surface, he was everything I'd ever dreamed of. But under the surface, behind those carefully crafted smiles and sweet words, was something darker, something more sinister. Something that would take me years to fully comprehend. Looking back now, I can see it all so clearly. How he slowly manipulated every part of my life, weaving his lies like a web that I couldn't escape from. He was the perfect actor, playing the role of the loving boyfriend while all the while he was calculating, scheming, using me for everything I was worth. There were the small things at first. Little comments that seemed harmless but would slowly chip away at my self-esteem. How he would tell me I was lucky to have him, how no one else would ever love me the way he did. I should have seen it then. That was the first sign, but I ignored it. Love, after all, can cloud your judgment in the worst possible ways, but it didn't stop there. No, the next step in his game was more subtle, more devious. I remember the first time he asked me to lend him money. It was for something small, nothing too significant, just a little help with an overdue bill. And of course, I agreed. What kind of girlfriend would I be if I didn't help him out when he needed it? But what I didn't know was that it was just the beginning. Over the next year, the requests became more frequent, more demanding. Can you lend me a little more this time? Or I'll pay you back soon, I promise. But the money never came back. It never even crossed my mind that he had no intention of paying me back. And by the time I realized what was happening, I had already lent him more than I cared to admit. And then came the emotional manipulation. The way he would twist my words, make me doubt myself, make me question my sanity. He knew exactly how to push my buttons, how to make me feel small, insignificant, and unworthy of anything better. It started with the gaslighting. At first it was subtle. He would deny things that had happened, make me question if I was remembering things wrong. I never said that, he'd say, even though I clearly remembered the conversation. But after a while it became more aggressive. He would accuse me of things I hadn't done, make me feel like I was the one in the wrong when, deep down, I knew I wasn't. But it wasn't just about making me feel bad. No, his real aim was to isolate me, to make me feel like I was nothing without him. He would subtly undermine my friendships, telling me that my friends didn't care about me the way he did, or that they were a bad influence. Slowly, without me even realizing it, I found myself pushing everyone else away. My world became smaller and smaller, revolving entirely around him. And the worst part, he was so good at it. He could make me believe that everything he did was for my own good. He'd tell me he was only looking out for me, that he was the only one who truly understood me. Every time I tried to leave or even question his behavior, he would manipulate me back in, making me feel like I was being selfish, like I was abandoning him. Looking back now, I feel foolish for not seeing it sooner. But at the time, I was so deeply entrenched in his web that I couldn't see the truth. I couldn't see that he was slowly destroying me from the inside out, one small manipulation at a time. But there were moments, small fleeting moments, where I did see the cracks in his facade. The way he would get angry when I questioned him, the way he would belittle me when I tried to assert myself. And there were times, too, when I would catch him in a lie, but instead of confronting him, I'd let it slide, brushing it off as nothing. I thought I was just being paranoid. After all, he was the love of my life, right? He couldn't be the villain in my story. But as the years went by, things began to unravel. Slowly, I started to regain a sense of clarity. The lies, the manipulation, the emotional abuse, it all started to build up. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I knew that something had to change, but I didn't know how. He had so thoroughly controlled every aspect of my life that the thought of breaking free seemed impossible. But then, something unexpected happened. I hit rock bottom. It wasn't one particular event that did it, but rather the cumulative effect of everything that had been building up. I found myself in a place where I couldn't breathe anymore, where I couldn't stand to be around him for another minute. I felt like I was drowning, trapped in a relationship that had slowly sucked the life out of me. That was when I knew I had to do something. I had to take back control no matter the cost. The next step wasn't easy. Leaving him was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it was the beginning of my journey to reclaim my life, to take back what was rightfully mine. And it was just the beginning of what would ultimately become my greatest act of revenge. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to turn everything he had taken from me into something far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. I wasn't just going to walk away. I wasn't going to let him win. No, I was going to take what he had stolen from me, my confidence, my strength, my voice, and turn it into something that would change my life forever. But how? That's the question I'm sure you're asking yourself right now. How did I go from being the victim to being the victor? How did I manage to transform the pain, the heartbreak, the betrayal into something so powerful that it would become my redemption? Stay tuned, because this is only the beginning. The real story, the one where I take everything he thought he had destroyed and use it to rise higher than I ever could have imagined, that's what's coming next. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. The moment I made the decision to take back control, I knew something had to change. I wasn't going to just walk away and let everything I had endured be for nothing. No, I had something far more significant in mind. I needed to make him pay, but not in the way he expected. This wasn't about petty revenge, It was about reclaiming my life and turning the story around. I wanted to show him and the world that I was stronger than he ever thought possible. And that's when the plan started forming. It wasn't something I came up with overnight, nor was it a sudden burst of inspiration. No, it had been brewing for a long time, ever since I started to feel the cracks in our relationship, ever since I began to see the true nature of what he was doing to me. The manipulation, the lies, the emotional toll, it was all too much. But in the midst of all that darkness, a small spark of something stronger began to grow. I had to be strategic. I had to be smarter than him. He thought he had all the power, that he had broken me down to nothing. But what he didn't realize was that I had been quietly collecting every ounce of strength, every moment of clarity, every bit of my soul that he had tried to steal. He thought he could take everything from me, but he was wrong. I had something he could never take, my story. I began to write. At first, it was just a way for me to release all the pent-up emotions. I had kept everything bottled up for so long, pretending that everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. Writing became my escape, my therapy. I poured every ounce of pain, frustration, and anger into the pages. But as I kept writing, I realized something. This wasn't just cathartic for me, it was something much bigger. This could be my ticket to taking back my power. I began to document everything. The lies he had told me, the manipulations I had fallen for, the moments when I should have known better but didn't. I wrote about the times I felt suffocated by him, the emotional blackmail, the way he made me feel small and insignificant. But I didn't just write about the pain. I wrote about how I was going to rise above it, how I was going to use this experience to build something far greater than anything he could have imagined. If that revenge hit just right, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more epic comebacks and justice-served stories. Drop a comment below, I'd love to know what you would have done in their place. The more I wrote, the clearer my vision became. This wasn't going to be a story just about me. This was going to be a story that others could relate to. People who had been manipulated, abused, or taken advantage of. I knew there were others out there who had gone through the same things I had, and I wanted to give them a voice. I wanted to show them that they weren't alone, that they could rise above their circumstances just like I was going to. The idea of a book took root in my mind. But it wasn't just going to be any book, it would be a book that exposed the truth, a book that would make people sit up and take notice. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how powerful it could be. This wasn't just about getting my own revenge, this was about changing the narrative. This was about taking everything he thought he had stolen from me and turning it into something far more powerful than he could ever imagine. But to make this happen, I needed to plan. I needed to be meticulous. I couldn't just write a book and hope it would magically change everything. No, I had to make sure that every word, every sentence, every chapter would have a purpose. I needed to expose him for who he truly was, but I also needed to make sure that I wasn't seen as the victim. I needed to show strength, resilience, and determination in every page. I knew the book had to start with my story. It had to start with the truth about what happened, about how I was manipulated and taken advantage of. But it couldn't stop there. It had to evolve into something more. I couldn't just write about the pain and the heartbreak. I had to show how I turned that pain into something positive, how I used it to fuel my journey of self-discovery and empowerment. The world needed to see that there was more to this story than just the betrayal. It was about what came after, about how I overcame the darkness and found my strength. As I sat at my desk, writing furiously, I could already feel the momentum building. Each day I would write more, adding to the narrative, expanding on the plan. I would spend hours crafting every word, carefully considering how best to tell this story, how to turn my personal experience into something that would resonate with others. I began researching everything I could about successful books, about the elements that made a story unforgettable. I learned about the structure, the pacing, the emotional beats that would hook readers and keep them engaged. It wasn't long before the writing took on a life of its own. I found myself immersed in the process, losing track of time, completely consumed by the narrative I was creating. I could see it in my mind, the book that would change everything, the book that would take my story and turn it into a weapon of empowerment. But I also knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Once the book was finished, it would have to be published. I knew nothing about the publishing world, but I was determined to make it happen. I reached out to agents, publishers, anyone who could help me bring this book to life. The rejections came fast and hard, but I didn't let them discourage me. I knew that this was bigger than just me. This was a story that needed to be told, and I would find a way to make it happen. But there was one thing I hadn't counted on: he would find out. I knew that once the book was published, he would see it. He would know that I had turned my pain into something powerful, and I couldn't wait for that moment. I couldn't wait for him to see what I had done with everything he had tried to destroy. But what I didn't know, what I didn't expect, was how much this book would change my life. The moment I signed the contract, the moment my book was in the hands of readers, everything shifted. People began reaching out to me, telling me how much my story had resonated with them, how much they had seen their own experiences reflected in my words. And suddenly, it wasn't just my story anymore. It was the story of anyone who had ever felt small, anyone who had ever been manipulated or taken advantage of. The book became a bestseller, not just because of the story I told, but because of the way it made people feel. It made them feel seen, heard, and empowered. It made them believe that they could take control of their own lives just as I had. And that, in the end, was my ultimate revenge. It wasn't about hurting him. It wasn't about making him suffer the way he made me suffer. It was about taking back everything he had tried to take from me and using it to help others. And now here I am, telling you this story not as a victim but as a victor. Because I didn't just survive what he did to me. I thrived. I turned my pain into power, and I created something that would outlast him, outlast all the lies, and leave a legacy that no one could ever take from me. But the question remains: what happens when the person who thought they had control realizes they've lost it? That's a story you'll have to wait to hear. Trust me, it's one you don't want to miss. As I watched everything unfold, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. I had been so focused on the pain, on the heartbreak, on the feeling of betrayal that I had almost forgotten what it was like to feel alive again. But now, as the pages of my book started to take shape, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just the act of writing or even the idea of publishing it, it was the realization that I had outsmarted him. I had played the game and I had won. It wasn't about getting back at him in the traditional sense. It wasn't about revenge that would leave him broken or humiliated. No, my revenge was far more effective, far more satisfying than that. My revenge was in the power I had taken back, in the life I had rebuilt from the ashes of everything he tried to destroy. He thought he had me under his thumb, that he could control me with his lies and manipulations. But what he didn't see coming was the strength that was quietly growing inside me. I had always been intelligent, but I had allowed his control to cloud my judgment. I had let him convince me that I was nothing without him, that I was too weak to make it on my own. And for a while, I believed him. But now, every step I took toward reclaiming my life felt like a blow to his ego. Every word I wrote in my book, every email I sent to publishers, was another reminder that I was in control. But what really made it all the more satisfying was the moment when I realized that he had been watching all along. He had seen the book, of course. I had known he would. And the look on his face when he first realized that I had turned everything he did to me into something so powerful was priceless. He had thought I was broken, that I would always need him. But in reality, it was the other way around. He needed me to prove to himself that he could control me, but now he had nothing. I could have said something to him, I could have confronted him and let him know how much he had hurt me. But I didn't need to. The fact that he had seen my success and could do nothing about it was all the revenge I needed. My success wasn't just about selling a book, it was about showing him that I was more than he ever thought I could be. And in that moment, I realized the true power of my revenge. It wasn't about revenge at all. It was about healing. It was about taking back what was rightfully mine, about becoming the person I had always been without his influence. And it felt good, it felt liberating. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. He had tried to break me, but in the end he made me stronger, and that in itself was the ultimate payback. The book was a success. But while that victory felt good, it was only the beginning. The real battle, at least the one I hadn't fully anticipated, was about to unfold. There's a certain satisfaction that comes with taking back control of your life, with turning your pain into something powerful. But there's also something unexpected that happens when you do. People begin to take notice. Not just the people who have been cheering for you from the sidelines, but also those who wish to see you fail. And that's when everything started to shift once more. It wasn't long after my book hit the shelves that I began to receive strange phone calls and messages. At first, I thought it was just people reaching out to congratulate me, or perhaps others who had been through similar experiences and felt a connection to my story. But then the messages started to take a darker turn. Threats, legal threats. You don't know who you're messing with, one email said. You've crossed a line, we'll see you in court. At first, I laughed it off. I thought it was some sort of empty bluff, a tactic meant to intimidate me to make me back down. But as the days went by, the threats became more frequent, more specific. It didn't take long before I realized something. He wasn't done with me. For a moment, fear crept in. It was one thing to face him emotionally, to turn my pain into a book, but this was different. This was the law. This was his power, his real power coming into play. And it terrified me. What if he had the money, the resources, the connections to drag me through a legal battle that I couldn't win? But as I sat with those thoughts, something inside me clicked. I had already faced worse. I had already survived the emotional torment, the manipulation, the gaslighting. Now I had a chance to fight on my own terms in a completely different arena. And I was ready. I reached out to a lawyer. It wasn't easy to find someone who understood the intricacies of my case. My book, after all, wasn't a simple account of betrayal. It was a story that exposed the raw, painful truth of what had happened. But eventually, I found someone who believed in me, someone who understood what I was up against. And so, the legal battle began. It started with the cease and desist letters, the threats of defamation lawsuits, all the usual tricks to try to silence me. He thought that the law could scare me into backing down, into erasing the truth of my story. But I wasn't going to be intimidated. I had already gone through the hardest part of my journey. I had faced the worst version of him. Now I was ready to face this. The next few months were a whirlwind. I spent countless hours meeting with lawyers, reviewing documents, and preparing for the inevitable court battles that loomed on the horizon. But with every step, I grew stronger. I wasn't just defending my book anymore. I was defending my right to speak my truth, to own my narrative, to make sure that no one could take that away from me. And then came the day that I knew everything would change. The legal documents arrived in my inbox, the ones that confirmed that he was actually taking me to court. The accusations, ridiculous. He was claiming that I had defamed him, that my story was nothing but lies, that I had damaged his reputation. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had spent 3 years using me, manipulating me, and now he was trying to paint himself as the victim. It was almost laughable, except it wasn't. I knew that I had to take this seriously. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the people who had been through the same kind of trauma, who were still too scared to speak up, to tell their own stories. If I let him win, if I let him silence me, I would be sending a message to everyone else who had ever been in a toxic relationship. Stay quiet, keep your truth to yourself, because if you speak out, you'll be punished. I wasn't going to let that happen, but the legal process was draining. Every hearing felt like a battle, every argument a test of my resolve. The court system was slow, frustrating, and sometimes it felt like we were getting nowhere. But I couldn't give up. I knew what was at stake, and I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let him take back the power I had fought so hard to reclaim. Then came the breakthrough. It was one of those moments that you never forget, the moment when everything shifts. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just a small piece of evidence that changed the course of the case. But it was enough. As we dug deeper into his past, we uncovered a pattern, patterns of manipulation, deceit, and even prior legal cases where he had tried to use his wealth and influence to silence people who threatened to expose him. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about a larger story, one that was bigger than any one person, and the truth, the real truth, was starting to surface. As the evidence mounted, his defense began to crumble. The lies he had told, the stories he had spun, none of it held up. The more we exposed, the weaker his position became. It wasn't just about my book anymore. It was about his reputation, his actions, and the web of lies he had built around himself. And when the case finally went to court, when the truth was laid bare for everyone to see, the weight of it all became undeniable. I won. The case was dismissed and the court ruled in my favor. Not only was I vindicated, but I had proven something far more important, that the truth could not be silenced, no matter how much power or influence someone had. In that moment, as I walked out of the courtroom, a weight lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't just the legal victory that mattered. It was the knowledge that I had taken control of my life in every way imaginable. I had fought not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless, everyone who had ever been told their truth didn't matter. It wasn't just about getting back at him. It was about ensuring that I, and others like me, would never have to be silenced again. The moment the court ruling came through, everything changed. I watched as the life he had built, the facade he had so carefully maintained began to unravel before my eyes. His world was crumbling in ways he could never have anticipated. It was the perfect downfall, a slow, inevitable collapse, much like watching a building topple under its own weight. First came the financial loss. He had relied heavily on his connections and reputation to secure deals, but the court case exposed his true nature. His investors pulled out, his business partnerships dissolved, and the social media backlash was relentless. People were no longer willing to associate with someone whose darkness was now laid bare. Then came the loss of honor. The professional respect he once commanded evaporated. Colleagues distanced themselves and clients refused to do business with him. The shame of the legal defeat, the public embarrassment, it was all too much for him to handle. He had always been the manipulator, the one pulling the strings, but now it was his turn to feel the weight of the consequences. And finally, the mental collapse. I watched as he spiraled, drowning in guilt and regret but unable to admit his wrongdoings. Every effort to reclaim his status was futile. He lived in a constant state of denial, clinging to the idea that everything was someone else's fault. It was a tragic end, not of my making, but his. His downfall was not about revenge. It was the natural consequence of his actions. And for me, it was the final, satisfying proof that justice had been done. As the dust settled, I found myself in a place I never imagined I'd be. Not only had I reclaimed my life, but I had turned my pain into something powerful that could inspire others. The book, the legal victory, the public acknowledgement of the truth, they were all pieces of a puzzle that I had carefully put together. But now the real journey began. It was time to take what I had learned and share it. I started speaking to groups, offering advice, helping others who had been through similar experiences find their voice. My story wasn't just my own, it was a collective experience, a lesson that resonated with anyone who had ever been manipulated, betrayed, or silenced. I wanted to show them that they, too, could rise above their circumstances, that their strength wasn't defined by their past but by how they chose to move forward. Through speaking engagements, online communities, and writing, I turned my